You're live, so it says. And guys, welcome. Good to see you all again. Nice of you to join. And what I'm going to be doing this evening is talking about whether we're going to start off with whether the National Retrofit Plan is doomed to failure or not. And that is the plan to build 500,000 or to retrofit 500,000 houses up to a standard of a B2 or higher. And at the moment, we have, for those of you in Ireland, the BER system. If you're in the UK, it's the EPC system, and that is the energy performance of your property. And a lot of houses in the Irish market would be older houses built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever it is. And a lot of those houses are like a D-rated BER. And so there's a lot of room for improvement. Your electricity bills, your gas bills, your oil bills will all be pretty high because you have very poor insulation standards and things like that. And so there's a plan in the government, and they announced it a couple of years ago, and it's called the National Retrofit Plan, as far as I can remember. And its aim is to retrofit 500,000 houses across the country and bring them up from a BER of D or C or whatever level that they're at, and bring them up to a B2. And there's a significant spend in order to achieve that. You've got to do, in order to achieve a BER of, say, a B2 or even higher. Like, I'm living in an A1 house because it's a new build. But if you're trying to do that to an old property and you're trying to bring it up to these kind of standards, there's a fair bit of work involved in retrofitting insulation. And a lot of the time, you're not going to be able to do the insulation on the inside of the house. So you actually can externally mount it, and you can do it on the outside of the house. So anyway, as always, guys, you can ask me any questions you have in property related, investment related, finance related. Happy to dive in. But while I'm waiting for the questions to populate, I'll just talk about this National Retrofit Plan. And we were looking at the numbers earlier, and 36,000 houses have been, had this stuff done in 2023. We're going to have to wait and see what 2024 brings. But in order to achieve 500,000, let's say in 5 years, that's 100,000 houses a year that would have to be done. And we did 36,000 in 2023. So big question, whether or not we can achieve this. Now, if we don't achieve it, the EU will fine Ireland for not meeting its targets. So it's obviously in the government's interest. It's in the national interest for us to do this, first of all. Second of all, not just for the financial sort of reason, but it's going to be embarrassing, when a government goes, especially when it has a Green Party in it. If the Green Party is, to be taken seriously, then obviously they want to make sure that they've managed to meet the environmental commitments that we've made over the last couple of years. So that is essentially what will be the political pressure from the Green Party. And then the other parties that are part of the coalition, they don't want to be seen to be fined for not meeting the targets that they had set for themselves. But what does it mean to you, the person living in a house, or to you if you're thinking of buying a property? What does the road ahead look like if you're thinking about buying a property for your home, or you're thinking about investing in property to have rental income? And if you're looking at that, then why would you invest, we'll say, in a property? You're going to start collecting rent. Why would you spend, another couple of, we might say 50,000, maybe 70,000 euro would have to be spent on a property to bring it up to the standard that we're talking about here. And so to give you an idea, some of the measures that they allow, so there's a grant that you can actually get, and the grant will pay you for doing the following things. So if you install a heat pump, you'll get the money back for that, or you'll certainly get some of the money back for it. If you install a heating controls in your house, you can get that, you can claim that stuff, grants on that. Solar PV cells, photovoltaic cells that go and get mounted on the roof, those can be claimed back, or certainly some of the cost of those. Insulation. So a lot of people will do roof insulation and wall, attic installation and wall installation and all that kind of stuff, insulation. And when you do that, you can claim back grants for that as well. Now, floor insulation is obviously a much bigger job. If you're going to lift your floors and put in thicker insulation, you have to think about what impact that is going to have on your house. It's going to make all sorts of adjustments kind of necessary. So if you're lifting, we'll say, if you're adding 100 mil to the height, to the insulation in your floor, what you're looking at there is all of your doors having to be shortened. And when it comes to the stairs, if you have a stairs going upstairs, your lowest step is obviously going to be shorter, which becomes a bit of a trip hazard. So you have to think about how you would treat that. So there's a bit more work in that. And also a lot of piping and stuff happens underneath the floor. So you need to be thinking about the location of that stuff. Now, all of that work that I've just mentioned, all of that has to be carried out by a registered contractor. That is a contractor that is registered with the SEAI. And the SEAI is the firm that basically looks after all of these grants are issued by the SEAI, and that is the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Now, you can do additional stuff. So you can have, we'll say, windows and doors improved. If you go into a new house, one of the big differences that you're going to see, and I can speak from experience because this is an A1 BER rated house. New houses don't have letterboxes. You don't have a hole in your hall door that is drafty. You don't have a fireplace where you can light a fire. And so there's a lot of little things like that that make a big difference to the amount of drafts and things like that you can have in a home. So it makes a difference, but you can get windows and doors, you can get those upgraded by anyone. They don't have to be a registered for the SAAI. But one of the problems that there is with this system at the moment is that the maximum that you can claim back for your in terms of grants and stuff like that, the maximum you can claim back is 35,000. But anyone who has done a project like this, you're talking about spending at least 50,000 on all of those measures that we're talking about. And so you'll have to spend 50 grand on that stuff in order to get 35 grand back. So it's going to cost you some money. But the piece that's missing in terms of, what people don't seem to realize is that there's a whole lot of additional work that has to happen. So you don't just start working, you have to hire an architect or an engineer to kind of help you with the design and the planning and stuff. So that's the first thing. And I don't mean, the planning for, changing the house significantly, but if you're going to go and do any of this work, you're going to need to get a contractor on board. The contractor is going to have to do a certain amount of work. So if they want to, we'll say if you want to go and put in all this insulation on the walls, a lot of stuff has to happen to make that possible. So if you're doing it internally, then doors have to be moved and shifted around. And so there's a lot of additional work. If you're going to completely refurbish and modernize a house that is an old house, perhaps what you're looking at doing there is taking out all of the plumbing system, taking out all of the electrical system and replacing it with a new system. Because if you're going to the trouble of doing all of this work, you may as well have new stuff. So a lot of the time people will go and just the enabling works that make it possible for you to do the 50 grand of expenditure, you might have to spend another 20,000 on that work. So you could be looking at a total spend of maybe 70,000 and the max you're going to get back is about 35. So it's going to come out of your pocket. Now, one of the benefits is that you can actually get a loan from, I think at the SEAI or somebody, I can't remember exactly the details, but you're able to get low interest loan for the works. So at least when it's not coming out of your pocket and you have to kind of go off and speak to banks and the banks are skeptical and things like that, that can be a bit of a difficulty. But if you'll actually get a loan and the loan is at a lower interest rate, so at least it's a low cost loan, that's a benefit. Why would you go to the bother of doing this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. But it's not clear. Like, I'll explain some of the reasons now, but to anybody who's looking at doing this work, you're probably going to be scratching your head wondering, is there any point in actually doing this? Like, what are the benefits? If I have to spend 70 grand and I'm only going to get 35 back, then this is costing me 35 grand. Like, why would I go out and do that? And so what you've got to do in this particular case is consider, first of all, the savings that you're going to have from your energy bills. So if you are going to upgrade your house, you have to go and put in a heat pump, we'll say. A heat pump replaces your gas central heating or your oil central heating. But a heat pump doesn't run itself. Like, it runs from electricity. So your electricity bills will go up a corresponding amount. But at least you're not having to pay all of the fuel bills for gas or oil. Now, in this house that I'm living in now at the moment, the cost is significantly lower than I was paying in an older house. I think I was in a 1990s kind of a house. And the 1990s house was very expensive to heat because it had very poor insulation. I just mentioned the letterbox there, and that was, I can remember in the winter sitting in, feeling this draft coming across and going, where the hell is that draft coming from? It's the letterbox. And so things like that can be very drafty, especially an old fireplace. People love an old fireplace. A lot of people will sort of say, oh, it's lovely at Christmas, light a fire, throw in the coal and the logs and stuff like that. But for the rest of the year, that's a terrible source of cold draft and stuff. So all of that gets done away with when you're into a house, into a new BER high, a good energy efficient house. You remove all of those things, but your bills are likely to fall, but maybe not for, like, at the older houses, maybe not as much. I think my bills fell by about 50% because I moved into a brand new house and has much thicker insulation in the walls and stuff. But that would have been a potential reason to go and do it. But I think the big reason that a lot of people will consider doing this is because if you're going to take a house, let's say an old house that's like a D-rated BER, you take that old house and you go and do a big refurbishment of it to bring it up to a higher energy standard, that will increase the value of the house. There's no question. But what also it'll do is it'll make the house more attractive to the banks to finance, because the financing is, the banks are looking at their loans and they're looking at how many years from now will we continue to be funding a house that is a D-rated BER. And that doesn't look good for them. Banks are looking to green their loan books. And to green it means that the properties that underwrite their loan are all higher energy rated houses. So something like an A-rated house or an A-rated building is much more attractive to the bank to finance than a D-rated one. Because by 2030, these guys are going to, like, investors in these big banks and stuff are going to be looking at them saying, no, a lot of their loan book is made up of, dirty properties, essentially, like polluting properties, and therefore they won't want to touch it. And so this is worth thinking about. The bank's willingness to finance you can see it in the rates that they charge. So if you go and have a look at the main banks and have a look at the mortgage rates that they're offering, there's probably in some cases a full 1% cheaper to actually have an A-rated house versus a different house. And so it's worth thinking about. That would actually definitely save you on your loan interest every month. But it's also possible that the property value has gone up. Now, I know somebody who went and did some work on their house and they lifted the BER from D up to a B or something, or maybe even higher. And they saw it might have cost them 30 grand. They got a grant for some of that, and then the house went up in value by about 70 or 80 grand. So they actually added more money or more value to the property than they spent on getting it to that higher level. So that itself is interesting. So your interest rate that you're paying, the value of your house, and then the other thing is the bills. Now, one of the things to consider is because the National Retrofit Plan was announced a couple of years ago, and they said their plan was to get 500,000 properties up to a sort of an A or a B rated BER. What's going to happen is, as time runs out, the pressure is going to come on the government to come and do all of this stuff. And so what we're going to find is suddenly there's probably more incentives to do this, but also probably more fines, or sort of, we'll say, if you can consider the carrot on the stick, if there is a reason to kind of like make you want to do this, we call that a carrot. If there's a reason that you'd be like saying, oh Jesus, I better upgrade the house, that's because they're waving a stick at you, and they're kind of saying you better go and do this. So what would that look like? Well, if they want to wave a carrot at you, they might say, guys, there is like a load of let's say there's a load of tax breaks for people who have upgraded their house, and so anyone who owns a property has to pay property tax. One of the ways they might incentivize this is say, if you've done your house up to a BER rating of a B or more, you don't have to pay property tax. Everyone else, the property tax is going up. And so people will suddenly go, Jesus, it's worth my while doing that. So that's an incentive. But what about a sort of a risk, or what about a problem? One of the things that they could do is, obviously, if they increase the property tax, then that's going to be a stick against you leaving it as it is. One of the other things they can do, and they were bringing this out in the UK up until just recently. Jason, good to see you. Nice to see you here. One of the things that I've seen in the UK is they were bringing this energy rating. So the EPC in the UK, the BER here in Ireland, the EPC in the UK, they were saying that if you wanted to rent a property, it had to be a minimum of a C rating, as far as I can remember. And that meant that if you had, we'll say, an old dated house that had poor insulation, that might be an E-rated house or a D-rated house. You were no longer in a position as a landlord to rent that property. It was banned from the rental market because it had a poor tax, or it had a poor energy rating. And so this was the plan. And so a lot of landlords were out there making this retrofit, forcing it through, because they thought, Jesus, my whole portfolio will not be rentable unless I do this. And so that was the first thing. But then, and it was coming up to the national elections, of course, in the UK. So this would have been part of the motivation for dropping it. But they decided, Rishi Sunak decided, you know what, we're actually kicking that out for about another 5 years. So you won't have to upgrade your properties in order to continue to rent them. And so that's what happened. And that's just last year. And so that's kind of, in a sense, a sigh of relief for a lot of landlords that were suddenly saying, thank God, I don't have to go and spend all that money. Interest rates have increased. It's not the right time to be doing that, etc., etc. But there was a lot of guys that were, we'll say, faster acting, and they went out and they spent the money and they did all of this work in anticipation of the problem. And suddenly they're like, what? You mean I spent all that money and I didn't have to? So they're a little bit frustrated by it. But ultimately what it means is that the amount of the environmental cost of kicking it down the road another 5 years is quite high. And but then the thing is I suppose that's one of the benefits of Brexit for people in the UK, was that the EU can't slap a fine on you if you're no longer part of the EU. And so that's at least something. So guys, that's the first part of it. If anyone has any questions on that whole thing about energy rating and getting the grants and all that kind of stuff. I have one of the members of my mastermind is actually an expert in all that area, and we were just talking about it this evening. So that's something to consider if you're interested in joining the mastermind. What I was going to say now is those of you who have questions, and I see there's a fair few comments and stuff in TikTok, but I always go straight to my school community first. And my school community is the first place that I look for questions. So I'm just going down through some of the questions at the moment. And I see somebody asking about rent to rent in Ireland. Now, those of you who are not familiar of the term rent to rent, it's actually an interesting idea. But people go out there and you're sort of thinking, I can't afford to buy a property. I'm not going to be able to get on the housing ladder. But there are people that are actually going out there. And what they do is they find a house to rent. And let's say one of the bigger houses, you find it, you find the landlord, have a conversation with the landlord, and you explain that, look, you've got all of the headaches of having to upkeep the house. You've got to go and look after all of the tenants' needs. If the tenant is complaining about something broken, you've got to deal with all of that. It can be a bit of a hassle. I'm here to take all of that hassle off your hands. And what I'll do is I'll give you, we'll say $2,500 a month. Maybe the guy was hoping to get $3,000 a month or something like that. But you say, I'll give you $2,500 a month, but I will take on all responsibility. You will have no responsibility. So if the washing machine breaks, that's on me. I have to get that fixed. If the toilet's bust, I'll be the one who has to get that fixed. How do you like the sound of that? And some landlords might go, you know what, that is actually a really attractive deal, because all of the hassle, all of the people giving me a call, hassling me about something broken and this needs to be fixed and that needs to be fixed, somebody else is going to come along and take all that off my hands. And what they're going to do is pay me a fixed rent every month. And that's going to be, so landlord would sort of say, you know what, that's actually a great deal. I'll do that. So they rent to you, you take on all that. But as part of your agreement, what you've also done is you have said to the person that I'm going to go and I'm going to sub-rent this property. So you're renting me a whole house. Maybe I'm going to just, I'm going to rent the house from you, but I'm actually going to rent out individual rooms to individuals. And so that's called a rent to rent. And what people are doing is they're going out, they're doing this, and they're actually splitting up the property, taking on all those things, and they're actually earning a little bit more than the original landlord. And so even though they haven't purchased the property, they're actually able to earn rent from the property. And so that's an interesting way for people who are interested to get into the property market, but they're not able to afford let's say the deposit to get into it. This is a way to kind of get into the property market without that big financial outlay that's needed right from the start. And so it's worth looking at. So rent to rent in Ireland, and Mikey was asking, looking for info or wisdom from anyone who's doing it here in Ireland, and what are the do's and don'ts and stuff like that. So one of the things you got to be careful of is when you're getting into rent to rent is that you are committing to the landlord to pay them the rent come hell or high water. And so you have got to know that, first of all, you're taking on a good risk, because if that landlord that's renting it to you, for this to work, you really genuinely do have to take the hassle away from them. It's not going to work if, it hasn't worked out for you and you're asking to hand back the property to the guy, because then he has to kind of like take all that hassle back and stuff. So the best thing to do is, first of all, do your bit of homework, know what you can earn from the property, know if there's work to be done on the property, you want to make sure that you understand all of that stuff, because there can be work. If you're not careful, you can take on a property that actually has quite a bit of work needed to do. So you'd be the one spending that money that you've promised the landlord you'll take on. So you need to be careful about that. But that is it. Now, one of the things you have to make sure you do is that you make it very clear that you're planning to go and put this back on the market and rent it out to multiple people. And the reason that I say that is that some people kind of think that, oh, I better not say anything because that'll probably put them off the idea of the deal. And the reality is that that's going to be the reason that the guy breaks the lease with you in the event that he discovers that you're doing something that you hadn't disclosed to him. And there could be all sorts of reasons why that's a problem for him. Maybe insurance is null and void in the event that this thing has been done a certain way or whatever. So you've got to be careful. There's all sorts of cases going before the ORPTB where sort of a tenant was renting a place from a landlord, and then what they did was they sub-rented it out to like 4 or 5 people, and they were charging them more. So they were living in one room for free effectively and getting everyone else to pay the rent. And then they themselves moved out, but they actually felt that they had control of this. So it's effectively what we're talking about. But they never said anything to the landlord. So the landlord went over to speak to the tenant, and somebody answers the door that he doesn't know who they are. And he's like, can I speak to Mary? And it's like, Mary, there's no Mary living here. And he's like, well, there should be, because Mary has a lease with me. Who are you? And this is how it basically, was discovered. And whereas if Mary had the conversation at the outset, perhaps this would all been fine. But this is one of the issues that you have. And so it's worth thinking about. Structural surveyor. Does anyone know of a good structural surveyor for a purchase? This is from Clifford. Now, I'm reading from my school community. By the way, guys, if you're interested, the school community is completely free. And it's just a place where we do these questions and things like that. And usually the community jumps in and will answer. So it's worth your while becoming a member if you're not already. If you are a structural surveyor and you're looking for business, there's a client straight away looking for advice that you could jump in and give them some advice. And let's see, did somebody answer? Okay, Mikey jumped in with an answer there. So look, this is how it works. This is how the community works. Okay, we answered this question a week ago, so I'm not going to answer it today, but is business with a friend a good idea? And I explained all of that. So if you guys are interested, you can actually go back and have a look at how I answered that question. Getting into business with a friend is both a blessing and a curse. You want to be careful how you thread. Let's see, getting around the RPZ. I have a unit in an RPZ, that's a rent pressure zone, soon to be vacated by a tenant. The problem is the unit is about 60% below market value, as the current RTB registered rent is only 850, whereas he could be earning 1,800. He can only increase it by 2% or 17 euro. He's read the rules. It says that the unit has to be unrented for 2 years to get out of this. And so look, that's an issue that a lot of people are facing. And there's a couple of things that you can do. First of all, we were just talking about the National Retrofit Plan there. If you actually invest in your property and you increase the energy performance, that's from Slarg. I need to remove the trolls. Yeah, I know. There's an awful lot of trolls in here, but look, guys just like to spend their time. They've got nothing else to do, so leave them to it. Okay, so Finton, good to see you, Finton. Finton has jumped in. Peter Sweeney is a top surveyor in the Greater Leinster area. So anyone who's looking for an engineer or a surveyor, Peter Sweeney, there's a name for you. Now, I also, in terms of not specifically an engineer, but a building surveyor, I work with KRA, which is a firm owned by Christina Ravitch. So it's a great firm as well. I actually had Christina speaking at my event on Saturday. And so those of you who are interested, I have an event every 4 months in person. I usually bring a guest speaker in and we do all sorts of like workshops and we work on stuff. So if you're interested in that, reach out to me. Now, by the way, if you're in TikTok and you want to reach out to me, you're actually better off going over to my Instagram and following me there and reaching out, because the messaging in TikTok is not very good. Messaging in Instagram is good. Or alternatively, this is all being recorded in YouTube in the live section. So go in there and leave a comment there and I'll reach out to you guys. Anyway, getting back to the RPZ thing. So if you upgrade the energy performance of your property, and I think if it goes up, I can't remember exactly but if you go from a D to a B or something like that, that should get you, get you to the point where you're allowed to increase above the RPZ stated levels. And another thing is 2 years vacant. That is, if the property has been vacant for 2 years, that is sufficient. But like, why would anyone want to leave a property vacant just to avoid being, capped on your rent? A lot of the time, the cost of it being vacant isn't worth the increase that you're going to gain. So in a sense, it's not worth it. But the other thing is to refurbish the property. If you do a substantial, and the word is a substantial change in the layout, or to do sort of substantial refurbishment of the property, that is sufficient to actually get you out of the RPZ. And the question is, what is substantial? Like, that is where it can be kind of difficult, because it's subject to interpretation. One of the issues that you have is that I could say that, well, I've extended this and I've done that. Isn't that substantial? And somebody else might disagree that that's not substantial. And so, but I've heard people that a certain amount of work can be done, and it might be the widening of doors for wheelchair access. Like, a certain amount can be done, not like a massive up the entire property, and it's sufficient for you to be able to get out of the RPZ. So something to think about there. And anyway, I'll get on to the next question that we have here, and then I'll start jumping into the trolls and see what they have to say. HMO guru's advice, please. There's a person here. Warning, novice alert. Everyone, I'm crunching numbers to see what I could do with a HMO property with a huge amount of profit margin. So a 5-bed that I can turn into a 6-bed is around 550k to buy. Now, this is a UK-based guy. 20% down for the mortgage, for your mortgage or whatever, 110,000. Stamp duty. He's talking about 32,000 stamp, and then the mortgage payments. Now, one of the first things I'd say is buying a property for 550 in the UK. That sounds kind of pricey. You would want to be spending around 280 or 300 or something like that, and in euros before you start looking at a HMO. I don't think it's going to work much beyond 500,000, unless you can find properties in that area that are worth substantially more. Then maybe it's possible. But if you take a 5-bed and turn it into a 6-bed, that's also kind of limited. What I've seen people do is go from 5-bed to 7 or 8-bed. And so it's kind of like a large bed and breakfast, essentially, but you're letting people stay there on a long-term basis. And so it does check out in terms of the finances and stuff like that. But anyway, there you go. Saving, investing. Hi all. I'm currently in the process of saving, accumulating as much money as possible. I have established a robust saving plan over the past couple of months, and I intend to further commit to this plan over the next 15 months. I will have attained a targeted sum by December of this year. The plan would be to reach a lump sum and then to invest it. Is there a short-term investment strategy that I should adhere to for the next 15 months to give me a return? So this is, if you're looking to buy a property, a lot of people are struggling to get themselves into, it's good to see Phil here from New York City. Hi, Phil. If you're trying to buy a property and you're saving up your deposit, the big issue is, certainly here in the Irish market, the big issue is getting the deposit. I know, because if you're buying an investment property, the banks will not touch you unless you've got at least 30%, and I mean at least 30% of the purchase price of the property. Now, it's all different if you're buying this property as your own home. If you're buying it as your home, then what you're going to see is about 10% is the deposit that is required. Now, I just mentioned fill there, but like in America, from the guests I've had on my podcast, in America, you can go and put down as low as, I've heard, like 2.5% of the purchase price. And you go and put that down, and that's enough. You can borrow 97.5% of the mortgage. And so it's obviously much, much easier to invest in property in the US. The UK, I think it's 80-20. Here in Ireland, it's 70-30. And that's a hangover from the 2008 crash. When we had the crash, the banks all got so badly burnt that they actually got nationalized. The chairman and the CEOs all ended up, a lot of them ended up getting into big trouble. If not, actually, like in some cases, going after them for jail time. What a lot of them did is just lost their jobs and stuff. And certainly their salaries were massively, massively cut. And so the banks all got badly burned by that. And so they have got that kind of sense that they actually did. Islanders saying none of them got jail, but David Drum got jail. And he was the CEO of Anglo-Irish Bank. And I think I can remember when he got appointed CEO, he was 38 years of age. He was earning millions in a salary. And then the bank got into trouble in 2008, and they were trying to save the bank. And he did a couple of things to try to save the book. Not enough of them, yeah. Like the reality is what they were trying to save the bank essentially. And like what they did was, according to company law, was illegal. So there's no question he broke the law. But the way he saw it was, there was hundreds of people employed with this bank, and we were doing anything we could just to keep it from going into liquidation. If it went into liquidation, everyone loses their job. So he sort of felt like the pressure was so big that I had to go and do this stuff in order to save the bank. But after all of the crash had happened, suddenly you can't put the toothpaste back into the container, and you're like, oh, we broke a load of laws doing that. Are we in trouble? And sure enough, they came after them. And so he actually spent years living in the US, and they went and I think they extradited him back here, and maybe they didn't extradite him, maybe he came back, but he spent years trying to avoid going to jail, and ended up going and doing time. So just shows you what's happening in the banking thing. So these guys, they all got so badly burned that they now are they'll run a mile from any kind of investment property, because they're so scared of what happened in 2008. The rest of the world has kind of moved on, but they didn't get affected. They didn't get affected the way Ireland did. You didn't see all the banks in the US getting nationalized. You saw quite a few of them getting absorbed by other banks. So anyway, we'll see. Fintan ran the figures recently for a property in an RPZ, and it worked out better leaving the property vacant for 2 years in terms of cash flow, excluding maintenance, tax, etc. The payback by leaving it vacant, that's incredible. I mean, this just shows you, like, it's kind of amazing to think that you can actually leave a property vacant. And this is like, I know there's a couple of trolls and guys that disagree with me in terms of property investing and stuff like that. But the reality is that the government has a system at the moment, the RPZ system. And you kind of think that, the landlords shouldn't be allowed to increase their rents and all that. But what it's actually doing is creating this situation where it's in the best interest of the landlord to take the property off the market altogether. Now, that doesn't make any sense if you're trying to have properties filled with tenants, but you're making it the financial incentives so poor that it actually makes more sense to have it empty. Well, then the policy has failed. And somebody is always kind of thinking about what they're so somebody, let's see, is this you're proud of leaving houses empty while people are out on the street? Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying is that the policies of the current government are not working. If you have a situation where it makes more sense to leave the property empty than it does to collect the low rent, and you're not there's no mechanism to get the rent to the market level. You can see two houses next to each other. One is on 850, and the one next door is on 1,800. And the guy on the 850, that it's proof that there's a house next door renting for 1,800. So that's the market rent, and yet you're only able to get 850. And if you're in a situation where you're only able to get 850, and the market is at 1,800, well, then suddenly it's a major problem for you as the landlord. It means that your property is undervalued. I see people joining. Hello, good to see you guys. And I see lots and lots of comments. So it's interesting to see how there's so few comments coming in from Instagram and just dozens and dozens coming in on TikTok. But the funny thing about TikTok is that it's a lot of trolls and stuff like that. So anyway, let's see what Finton is saying. So for 2 years, there was year 6, i.e. it was vacant for 2 of the 4 years. And that made more sense for them in order to increase the property value. Somebody asking a question, Thomas was wondering, is there any way to speed up probate? No, there is not. It can be a very slow process. And I have seen the probate office take months and months and months. I know, I don't know how long your situation is, Thomas. Maybe you mentioned this last week, but I know somebody that we bought a property recently, and the probate was submitted in, I think it was in April, and we were waiting for the probate to issue in order to close the purchase of the property. And I think it was probably in I think it was like February or something like that. So a good 8 months later until the probate was issued. And the people that were selling the property were mad keen for us to purchase it, but they couldn't until they got the probate. And so that was one of the issues. And you just have to sit back and wait. Now, obviously, if you've done it correctly, it just has to make its way through the system. But sometimes, if there's a mistake there, they come back to, clarify and stuff. That can be problematic. There is no safety net for landlords. In 2008, 2009, 2010, even then, the government set a maximum rent for the property in order for tenants to get rent allowance. Yeah, this is true. Anyway, what can I say? This is, the housing crisis in this country is a major issue, and a lot of people are really, you've got two, it's a very, very split market. You've got people who are landlords thinking, what is probate? Probate is when if somebody in your family has died and has left the property, what typically happens is, we'll say an elderly person is living in a house and they die, and they leave the house to, say, a couple of kids, and the kids might be growing up or whatever. You have to go through probate, and that is where the will of that person is processed, and you basically submit it so that it all gets kind of registered for who's getting what tax is payable, all that kind of stuff. And the probate office deals with that. And the probate, you cannot sell a property until probate has issued. And so that is what we're talking about here. And so anybody who is inheriting a property, it might be yours according to the will, but it's not yours on paper until after probate has issued. And so that's effectively what we're talking about here. Anyway, let's see. Is it worth turning a house into a HMO? Well, that all depends. Okay, there are a lot of people that I have like in my mastermind that are going down this road, and some of them, yes, it's absolutely worth your while. Other people will sort of say it's actually a nuanced kind of an answer that you have to give, because the reality is property. Let's say you have a 4-bedroom house. You've got a downstairs living room that suddenly can be turned into something. So you have a 5-bedroom house, and sometimes people might be able to extend up into the attic. So now you've got 6 beds, and maybe you can extend out into the rear garden and create like a single-story extension that adds another 2. So suddenly it's an 8-bed. Now that's the kind of thing that I have seen, and you're able to get maybe 2,500 to 3,000 a month from one tenant living in that house. But if you go and rent out those 8 rooms to 8 different people, each of them might pay you 800. And so do the maths on that. Instead of getting 3,000 a month in rent, you're getting 6,400 a month in rent. So suddenly it is worth your while to do this. Now, it's not clear as day, though. It's not just like all of this extra profit. When you do a thing like that, you're taking on all the bills. And so it means that you will be, as the landlord, you have got the electricity bill, the gas bill, the water bill, whatever it is, whatever the different bills are, you're paying the property tax, everything like that. All of that is on your dollar or dime. And you got to be careful, because if it's an old house, if it has poor insulation, we started this entire live stream this evening talking about energy performance and the National Retrofit Plan. And if you've got an old house that is costing a lot of money in terms of heating it because it's got very poor insulation, what you're going to find is that the cost of heating it every month is astronomical. And if the guys that are living in your HMO, if they are not paying the bill themselves, then they couldn't care less, and they will just have the windows wide open while the heat is blasting and they're walking around in t-shirts. And this is the thing. Whereas if you're paying the bill, you'll have the windows closed, you'll have the heat off, you'll be wearing 2 jumpers. Like, that's the kind of, if it's your money and you're trying to save, you'll do one thing. If it's not your money, if it's not coming out of your pocket, you don't care, then you'll behave a different way. And so the landlords can suddenly find that it's costing them 2,000 a month or 2,000 every 2 months or whatever for the electricity or for the gas bill or something. So suddenly the profitability all disappears. Now, there's different ways to do that. But I think if you're going to look at a HMO, you have to be thinking in a kind of a grander scheme of things. You have to be thinking, okay, am I going to just rent this out in rooms, which might be a bit of a hassle? Or am I going to take a real professional approach? And I've seen the professional approach is where the central heating, you'll properly do the central heating. So it's individually heating every single room in the house. And it's the controls are adjusted by each room. And so, like in most houses, you turn the heat on and the heat is on in the entire house. In some of these newer houses, they have it like split, so you can heat the downstairs and leave the upstairs off, or you can heat the upstairs and leave the downstairs off. But rarely is it that you can have individual rooms heated on or heat off. And that's what one of the guys that I work with, that's what he's done. And the benefit of that then is that you can connect sensors. So in the event that somebody was to go out of the room, you have a sensor, a movement sensor up in the ceiling, like a PIR for an alarm system or whatever. As soon as that person leaves, the PIR will just pick up that there's nobody in the room, turns off the heat. If you go and open your window, there'll be a little sensor there, and the moment you open it, that's it. You're straight into the heating system being switched off and stuff. So these are the systems that you might think about if you're going down the professional HMO road, where you actually want to kind of keep a lid on the costs. There's lots of little things like that. And if you just think of it, rather than thinking of a HMO as some mechanism for getting extra rent, think about it in the eyes of the person who's renting it from you. Think about is somebody asking, where are you from? I'm Dublin based. So there you go. There's the answer. If you're looking at doing a HMO and you're thinking about it just purely in financial terms, then there's all sorts of shortcuts you can take, but it's not going to make for a nice experience. If you go and do a really professional job on it, then it can actually be a great experience for the person who's renting the property. Like, you'll have their own ensuite bathroom instead of it being a shared toilet situation. You'll have down in the kitchen or something like that, you will have maybe 2 cookers, 2 fridges, 2 washing machines. All of that kind of stuff will mean that for the extra people that are living in the house, there's not this massive demand on the appliances. There's enough of them to go around. Things like that can make a bit of a difference. And this is one of the reasons why you have to think about it. If you are taking a real professional approach, it's actually really nice for a tenant. If you think about it like this, at the moment, we'll say students that are thinking of renting, they'll find their university. Somebody will go out and they will rent a house, and they'll have to pay, let's say if you're in the Dublin area, you might have to pay 3,000 to rent a house. And that is a big sum of money for, say, a student. But what the student can do then is you can say, put an ad up in the university saying, I have a 5-bed house and I'm renting it out. So who wants to share the rent with me? And that would be a way for them to split, the house up and reduce the cost of the accommodation. And if you look, I know student rental, a lot of the time students, when they're renting on a weekly, they basically cost it out as a weekly cost. So if you're paying 1,000 a month, it's about 250 a week. That's what the prices are in some of the Dublin area for students and stuff. Now, but you're going to have, somebody has to take on that bill. Somebody's going to have to take on the electricity bill. They have to actually sign the contract with the electricity company in their name. Even though they're the student that's only sharing some of the costs, they'll have to go and sign that. A lot of the time, the electricity company is looking for some sort of a deposit if you're the first time. So that's another issue there. If you're going to go and have to sign up for, say, electricity and gas and things like that, this can cost you quite a bit of money. And are you collecting it from your housemates? If you are, that's great. But if you're not, it's a problem. And one of the things that I've seen is that just by taking all of this on as the landlord, you're taking on all those bills, and then you're just making the property available to an individual. They come along and they just simply go, yep, I'll rent that. And that's the only bill you have, is just that monthly cost of the room. You don't have to worry about signing for electricity bills and all that kind of stuff. One bill a month, and that's it. So I think that a lot of people will jump in and say, oh, you're taking a property away from somebody that is going to, put their family in there. And that's true. But it's also the case that when a student goes and rents a place like that, that's what they're also doing. And the difference is that the student is renting the whole place and doing a house share. The landlord is doing it, and is doing it slightly more professionally insofar as he's putting it as a service. And maybe he's even done up the house and reconfigured the upstairs so that every room is en suite, things like that. So this does make a bit of a difference as to how it's perceived, certainly, and what you can get. So for anyone who's saying like this is typical, greedy landlord hammering the tenant, it's not really. It's actually it's a benefit to the tenant insofar as they can find a place. They don't have to go through the hassle of the house share and all that. It is a service. Obviously, there are times when it suits the landlord to do that, and there's other times when it doesn't. And so this is what it comes down to. Let's jump into some of the questions. And as always, there are like about 1,000 questions in TikTok. So let me see if I can find the first one. What do you mean by property investment, owning and renting housing? Yeah, property investment is just simply buying an asset for the purpose of collecting rent from it, as opposed to buying it in order to live in it. So that's property investment. How much, roughly speaking, would one less bedroom make? Estate agent said it was a 3-bed, and then I don't know but one room is not big enough to be called a bedroom. So this is funny. What you say is traditional Irish 3-bedroom houses all are designed in the very same way, and every one of them comes out with a small room. I used to call it the box room, basically, but we're on the side of the house that has the staircase running up. Almost always the staircase eats into the room, so you end up with this kind of slanted floor where it's actually that you're effectively the ceiling of the staircase downstairs becomes the floor of your room inside, and so you end up with a segment of the room with this big sloping piece in it. And usually what people do is, in order to get around that, is they'll box it out and they'll turn it into a wardrobe. And I've seen that before, but what it means is that the room is small. Now, the room that I was living in a place up until about a year ago, and I was renting it, and it had one of those rooms. So it was a 3-bedroom house, but the bedroom, really, you couldn't fit a full-size bed into that room. So I just put my daughter, and she had a kind of a small kid's bed, and fit it nicely into that room. But like, you're in a market that is, it's, you don't get to choose when you're talking about this kind of thing. Like, if you were in another country where they have a big housing supply, maybe you could argue the case. But if you're not prepared to pay the rent for the 3-bed, even if you disagree that it's a 3-bed and you think that the bedroom is too small, I think you're really just going to end up finding yourself not chosen for that property, and there'll be 50 other people willing to rent it from the landlord and take it as they see it. So theoretically, you might be correct, but I don't think you're going to find that. Somebody asking, is this pre-recorded or live? So this is all live, but what I am doing is recording it over on YouTube. So if you're interested to catch this, you can go into my YouTube channel, Gavin J. Gallagher, J for James, and you'll find it there. Loan is from the bank, but underwritten by the SBCI. Okay, Alan, thank you for that. We've got from Chudson, how do you enjoy profiteering from the housing crisis, Gavin? Okay, there's one of the trolls. Like, I'm not profiteering from anything. I don't own any houses at all except my own one. I rent office buildings, but I do happen to have spent many years renting houses, and so I have plenty of experience of it. I also have a property mastermind, and I have 50 or 60 people in it that are all renting property, and so I can tell you what I'm hearing about. How will it, let me just get this question. Okay, how will a heat pump work in an old house, as the house has to be air, right? Yeah, like there's different types of heat pumps. You've got to look into it. Like, I'm not an expert around this stuff, so you'll have to go in that. But you can get people out there that will actually advise you on, first of all, the options and the grants, how to get those grants and stuff. Do you have any shame contributing to the housing crisis? Okay, you guys are doing great tonight. Josh, the heat pump is a waste of time in older houses. I have heard that as well. And I'll tell you, if you're going to go to the trouble of putting in a heat pump as well, what you should also, if you're doing it for the purpose of getting your energy rating up to a higher level, you should include PV cells, put in the solar panels on the roof as well. Because when you put in a heat pump, the heat pump actually, it is fueled by electricity. And so your electricity bill will naturally go up. And so if you have the PV cells on the roof, that will actually take your electricity bills down. And I know, like, I've moved into this house here that I'm in. It's an A1 rated house. And when I moved in, like, the bills are much, much lower. But I also have an app. The electrical provider that I'm with, there's an app on the phone, and I can actually see visually that my property has, like, during the day, during the say middle of the day, when the sun is in the sky, it actually shows the power consumption going right down and to zero. And so I'm actually paying nothing during those sunny hours, and then it kind of comes back up in the evening time. So it's really beneficial in that way. And there's different things that you can do. If people are on a night rate, you can actually install a battery, and the battery will actually charge during the night on the night rate, and it'll be topped up by the solar panels, we'll say, or whatever. But then you're actually getting power from the battery during the day. So there's lots of different ways to do it. And it's one thing to have a think about. If you're a renter, join CATU and fight back. Or the RTV, I guess. Gavin thinks making money from others being homeless is morally acceptable. He's a big man. Okay. Heat pump will only work in a new house. Yeah, I'm hearing that a fair bit. All right. How do you get rid of bad tenants who can't keep a rental clean? Well, there's a couple of different things. First of all, you got to do your homework on a tenant before you go and put them into the property. There's all sorts of checks that you need to do on a tenant. And you also need to check, if you're renting, you need to check on your landlord. There's actually a landlord rating system online somewhere, and it's basically rate my landlord kind of thing, and you can basically say whether a landlord is a decent guy or not. The other thing is tenants. So I've heard nightmare stories where somebody moves into a property, and after the first month of rent is there, they just stop paying, and they're like, okay, I'm in here now, try and get rid of me. And they go through the whole process of basically staying in the property until they are physically removed by the police, or they have to get the courts involved and stuff. So that you could end up accidentally landing on that kind of a tenant. So you really do have to do your homework. You have to check references. References will say from a previous landlord whether or not the person is, like the tenant, is it a good tenant or not? Now, one of the tricks that you got to look for is don't look for the current landlord. If somebody is living in a property today, getting a reference from that landlord is not a great idea, because if that tenant is a nightmare tenant, then that landlord wants to get rid of them. And if that landlord wants to get rid of them, then he's going to give them a glowing reference just to help get rid of them. So you're better off going to the previous to the current landlord. If somebody is, like, almost everybody will have had multiple landlords. So you go to the previous one and you say, I'd like a reference from your previous landlord, not your current landlord. And you'll get a more truthful thing from that person. Why? Because they're no longer, like, they don't have an axe to grind. They're not trying to get rid of them. They were tenants in their property. So you're going to get a truthful response from that landlord. The alternative will be that it is a fake reference. And this is happening a lot. And I'm working with somebody who is an estate agent, and she was saying that she is opening up references, and, like, first of all, it's clearly written by somebody who doesn't have English as their first language. And so it would have, like, the name and address would be an Irish person, but the way it's been written is clearly written by somebody who doesn't speak English in their first language. So somebody went and made this up, and you could see straight away that it was a fake one. But the other thing is that this fake letter is doing the rounds. And she opened up another reference from somebody else, and it was the exact same. Every single letter, even the typos were the same, but it was a different landlord at the top. And so there's like a group of people that are saying, here's a reference you can use my one. And just happened to be that this person saw the exact same one on the same day and put two and two together and went, okay. So they're both fake. And so that's the stuff. You got to be careful about that. You got to actually check out when you get a reference. You got to make sure that there's a phone number there or an email, so that you can actually get in touch with that person. And you really want to be talking to the person and asking them a couple of questions, not just some email that could be going back to a mate's friend, a friend or something like that. So anyway, that's one of the ways. So in order to get rid of a bad tenant, like, first things, don't get a bad tenant by doing your research at the very start, and make sure you do your homework. If you've got a bad tenant, and if you're going through the full RTB and all that, then you've got a big headache on your hands, because the Residential Tenancy Board, the RTB, all of the leases and in the country are basically registered through there. And because they're registered through there is a huge backlogs, first of all. But second of all, if somebody, you have to go through them in order to get your tenant out of the property, if you need to get rid of them. Now, if you just need to get them to keep the place clean or something like that, that's maybe just a conversation that you can have with them. You can maybe offer to go and get somebody to come in on a weekly basis and clean the property or something like that. But, like, once a person has, one of the things you got to remember is, once you've rented a property to somebody, it's their property, and you can't go in without advance notice and all that kind of stuff. You can't go and check up on them. They can live as they want, as long as they don't destroy and damage your house. And so if somebody is untidy, there's not a lot you can do about that unless they're, say, living in your property or something like that. Anyway, let me try and have a look. Oh, somebody, so this is a good one. Somebody, he's trying to call me a parasite, but he calls me a para and then another word, sight, instead of, and the word, and sight as in vision. And so nice one from Arslet. So anyway, how did you ever get a ride? That's a good one. Gavin goes to bed every night thinking homes are a commodity and not a basic human need. They are a commodity, I'm afraid. Welcome to the market system. This is, you live in a capitalist country, so that's what you signed up for. If you want to go and live somewhere else, you're most welcome to do that. And I'm sure they'll give you a free house or something like that in that other country. Anyway, those guys, it's not even directed at me anymore. Some of these comments are actually these guys having a row amongst one another. How much property tax in Ireland? How much is property tax in Ireland? Well, it depends. What you do with property tax, you can go into the property tax, just type property tax into the internet, and it'll come up at the portal, the PT, what is it called? The property tax portal or something like that. You go in there and you basically put in, you're given, if you own a property, then you'll have a PIN number and some sort of a password or whatever. You go in, the property is registered in your name, you have the address there, and you basically have to assign a value. So whatever your property is valued at, then you click on that value, and then it tells you what the property tax is. At least that was what it was for me the last time I went in there. Now, sometimes they make changes to this, so you have to kind of take it, but go in and check it and see. What do you do besides profiteering off the housing crisis? Yeah, we should have probably removed him. Okay, let me see. I wouldn't be making sense. What is it? It wouldn't be making sense for elderly people to upgrade, even if they had the means to. Yeah, I have to say, John's comment there, there's the whole idea of the National Retrofit Plan. It's all around trying to reduce the greenhouse gases being produced by Ireland as a nation. And it's because we made commitments that we would do this. But the commitments were for the entire country, not for just, and I mean the entire economy, not just the housing system. And so the reality is that there's quite a lot of greenhouse gases emissions coming from, say, the industrial sector. There's a lot coming from the agriculture sector. One of the biggest contributors of methane is actually agriculture. If you are a beef farmer, cows, they fart, and the cows, when they fart, they release methane, and that goes into the atmosphere. And because we are an agricultural-based economy, or certainly there's parts of the economy are very much agricultural-based, the agricultural base, we actually have a huge amount of emissions from the agriculture. Now, you can go and say, we're going to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we produce as a nation by so much, and it's going to drop down. But the reality is that it's very hard to go and get that down from, say, the agricultural sector, because it means, does it mean basically like having fewer cattle on your farm or something like that? That's obviously not so easy to do. Then when it comes to the industrial sector, there's certain sectors that are heavier than polluters than others. Like the oil sector it's greenhouse, it's fossil fuels, so it is not going to be great, regardless of what you spend on all sorts of mitigating technology and things like that. If you're extracting oil from the ground, or if you're processing oil or anything like that, like there's just a lot of emissions. So the easiest place to do it is get everyone driving less, or so put more bicycles on the road. That's one way to do it. Another thing is to make sure that more electric vehicles are driving on the road. That'll bring down the greenhouse gases. And then the other thing is the amount of people that have got houses that they're spending a fortune heating them with, you've got boilers that are fired up by oil, or you've got boilers that are fired up by gas. Those are two large greenhouse gas emissions. And those greenhouse gas emissions all contribute to the amount that is produced by the country. If you had a better, if your home heating system is, we'll say, a heat pump in a new home or something like that, that works really well. You're producing far less emissions. And so that's one of the reasons why you get the A-rated houses. And this contributes towards the national reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is all part of the commitments that the Irish government made to the EU. And they don't want to have to go back on that now and end up saying, sorry, we didn't meet the targets that we agreed. So they came out with this National Retrofit Plan. It was very ambitious, 500,000 properties. And what they were saying is that they were going to offer a grant of so much to so many people. The grant was coming in at something like, I think it was it 8 billion or something like that? It was the equivalent of 4,000 per house in terms of grants and things like that they were willing to offer. But the reality is, it'll cost you an awful lot more to do it than it will than $4,000. And so the grants that you're likely to get are only going to cover maybe 50% of what you're going to actually have to go and spend yourself. And but 500,000 properties. If you think about that, that's 500,000 divided by, say, 5 years. That's 100,000 properties in a year. At the moment, we're building 35,000 new houses every single year. And our construction sector is absolutely maxed out in order to achieve that. And yet, here we are saying that we're going to have also 100,000 properties are going to be retrofitted and brought up to this higher standard. And the problem is that the people that build new houses are tradespeople and skilled laborers, just the same as the people that are also trying to do these retrofits. So the pool that is going into this, you're pulling from the same pool. So who's going to get the priority? Is it going to be the new house builder, or is it going to be the retrofit? And the new houses, when you build a new house, you sell it and a person buys it. And the purchaser is supported by a mortgage provider and is also supported by, we'll say, the government in the grant system, like first-time buyers grants and things like that. Whereas a retrospective or a retrofit of your house, you have to pay that. You have to go and hire the contractor, and you have to come up with the money to do that. And what is the incentive to you? You have to come up with the money. You have to spend all of that money doing it up, and you get the grant back after the effect. You don't get it beforehand. And so you don't get your money up front and say, okay, here you go and spend that now on your. You actually have to get the work carried out, and then you claim what you've spent. And they actually look for bank statements to show that this money was spent. And so, yeah, it's important to think about that. So anyway, Chudson keeps on giving lots and lots of comments. I'll go and I'll just remove him from the probably easiest thing. I should have done this earlier, but the problem is that you never really have the ability to do multiple. I'm not a multitasker. I can't do two things at the same time. So let me keep going. Can I get a derelict grant if I buy a property through a limited company? That's a detail that I'm not familiar on. I would have thought possibly yes, but you need to go and check that out. Like, just go in and look up derelict grants and just look for the do's and don'ts and stuff. Frank, you'll hopefully get that. Don't see a landlord would want a job given how financially lucrative landlordism is. Like, there's this funny assumption that people have that becoming a landlord is this like absolute, you're on the pig's back. There's actually, it's not always that easy. Like, you're taxed quite heavily as a landlord in Ireland. There's not a lot of incentives to being a landlord in Ireland. And in order to actually make it work, you really have to know what you're doing so as to extract the maximum amount of value out of the property. And there's certain improvements you can make to the property that will do that. There are certain things that you want to look for to ensure that the property is actually going to, to increase in value. And all of that is stuff that I kind of teach my clients inside the accelerator. And those guys, like, because they're approaching it from a professional way, they'll actually get the thing. But for the average person who goes out and buys a property and is just renting it as a buy to let or something like that, the price that you pay is sufficient that it can be quite hard for you to really make it work. Because after tax and everything like that, it can be, it can be fairly marginal. I've seen some deals where, you're putting a couple of maybe 200 into your pocket after tax and things like that. It's not really a lot. And so you want to make sure you know what you're doing. I don't have family or friends. I'm alone here and I'm homeless and I'm ready to pay. I need a room. So look, this is the thing. There's so many people out there that there's, like, leaving the jokes aside or the trolls aside, homelessness is a major problem here. And one of the factors that have caused homelessness, in my opinion, is that back in 2008, the government decided that it was going to remove bed sits from the rental system. And they felt like that bed sits were a really shitty way in order to rent a property, that you were basically living next to your bed and your kitchen was right next to your bed and your living room was at the end of your bed. And so it was one room that you basically lived in, and that was everything. And you shared a bathroom with a couple of other people or something like that. Not very attractive, but it had its, like, there was people there that were still looking for that kind of a cheap option. And by removing it, it removed that option altogether from the market. And now you have huge amount of people that are actually homeless there. There's 14, from the latest figures I read, there was 14,000 people that are currently homeless. If they had just left those bedsits there, all of that would be available to those people that are currently homeless. Like, they took thousands of properties off the market basically by doing that. So it's something to just bear in mind, is the first thing. And like, when somebody is there talking about how expensive it is to go and find a property if you're homeless and stuff like that, like, I feel pretty bad about it. Like, I can imagine how difficult it is to be homeless in this market. But the reality is that like, it's not the landlords who are to blame. The landlords are actually providing a service for people who are looking to rent. And if you have a look at the amount of people that are renting compared to the amount of people that are buying to own, like, it's just the market is filled with people that are buying to own a property so that they can live in the property as their home. Is that, like, is it greedy for somebody to buy their own home? No, it's not. Now, why is it greedy for somebody to buy a property to rent it out to somebody who's looking to rent a property? That's the bit that I don't understand, is that not everybody is in the market to buy. There's a lot of people out there that are in the market just simply to rent, because maybe they don't have the deposit saved up in order to buy a property. So they have no choice but to rent. If there is no landlords on the market, then there's no properties to rent. What does that person do? They become homeless. And so this is one of the reasons why landlords provide a service that's beneficial. Now, the problem is that landlords, there's a nasty connotation around landlords, primarily because if you go back in history, the Irish sort of psyche goes back to the 1800s and the 1700s, and you had the big landed gentry that owned tens of thousands of acres, and they'd have their big manor house with 100 staff, and then they would own everything around and they'd be renting it out, and they were the big landlords that were renting out to the kind of let's say the paupers that just they were going to be like tenant farmers. And those farmers, they basically rented the land from the landlord and they grew potatoes on it, and that was enough to feed their family. And that was about all they did, was just literally grow enough potatoes to feed the family, and that was it. And so naturally enough, landlords, as a kind of a breed have been sort of tarnished from that historical view. Fast forward then to 2008, and anyone who was in the property market would have seen, the crash of 2008 caused by the banking crisis. But then it got worse and worse because the amount of people that had been buying, and they took out these huge loans, and those loans went on to pull down some of the banks. And so the landlords and the developers were seen as the cause of the crisis. And I think there's probably a certain amount of that would be fair, because there was guys that borrowed a lot more than they needed. But if you look at it now, you try to get money from the banks today, it's almost impossible. Like, they want all this information on you. They want so much information. It's very, very difficult to get money out of the banks here in Ireland today. Back in 2005, 2006, I can remember they were literally throwing money at you. Like, they couldn't lend you enough. Every time you borrowed some money, they'd be like, do you need any more? Like, could we give you the money to go and do up the property as well? Maybe we'll give you the money to actually buy a second home. Maybe you'd like an equity release. They were like asking you, would you like this money? So the banks were the cause of the banking crisis, because all they wanted to do was to extend their loan book. And what was that? Every time they grew their loan book, the guys all got paid hefty bonuses. And so they were going after that bonus structure. And that's the cause of the crash. But landlords are kind of lumped in with being to blame for that. And nowadays, because we have a housing crisis, anyone who's seen to be renting a property is considered to be scum of the earth, which is completely wrong. Because if you've got a property, let's say you bought a property and you have a family now and you've moved into a bigger property, why should you sell your first property if you decide, you know what, I'd like to keep that property, I'll rent it out for a couple of years, and maybe in 2 decades time I'll still own that property and I can leave it to my kids, and my kids will inherit something of value from me. What's wrong with that as an ambition? I don't think there's anything wrong with it at all. But somehow landlords are considered to be greedy because they've got this ambition. Whereas you can go and start a tech company tomorrow and you can become a billionaire, and everyone's going to think you're fantastic. You're an amazing dude. You've made billions and we all love you and we all worship you. But if you make 1,000 on a month as a landlord, oh God, you're scum of the earth, You're not, it's cool to make $1 billion as a property or as a tech founder, but make 1,000 as a landlord and you're scum. So, this is the problem, is there's a bit of a narrative there that I think we need to think about. Somebody says that they love my video on skyscrapers. Yeah, I made a couple of weeks back. I did something on that. Anyway, there's an awful lot of people here that are a little bit trolly, so I'm going to just block them so we don't have that kind of stuff any longer. Who pays the tax in a rent-to-rent scenario? So in a rent-to-rent scenario, you are creating income. So what you'll have is you'll have a couple of people that will have to pay rent or pay tax. Okay, so you're renting to the original landlord. That landlord is collecting, let's say, use the example I made earlier, 2,500 a month. I'm paying to a landlord 2,500. He's going to have to account for that. Maybe he has a mortgage, so a certain amount of it will be deducted, but anything that's left over, any kind of surplus, less the expenses and stuff, that will be taxable by the landlord. But then if the renter, if they go and they're paying the 2.5 grand and they're collecting 4 grand, we'll say, turning it into an Airbnb or something like that, well, their deductions will be 2.5 grand, and then they'll have a 1,500 profit, we'll say. That 1,500 profit is taxable. And how would you, I would say probably what you're going to do is, rather than having a lease in place, you're probably going to have a license in place. So that is effectively trading income. So you'll have to pay 12.5%. If you do it through a company, it's 12.5%. If you do it in your personal name, then it's 52%. And so you got to have a look at that. Anyway, going on to the next one. Do you think the state will provide 100% of homes for non-home owners? 100% of homes for non. I'm not exactly sure. Oh, that's actually back and forth. I understand now. Nobody. There's all these views. Nobody should own more than one house, that being their own home. Like, this is like communist Soviet Russia or something like that. Anyway, I'm going to try and find an actual valuable tenant or a valuable comment. Let's see. God, such trolls tonight. Okay, the truth is the free market has limits on plenty. For example, monopolies. Having limits on property ownership is not radical. I think it's kind of silly. Some of these, like anytime, I've seen this so many times. Anytime the government introduces some sort of legislation that is aimed at putting a cap on what happens in the property market. And of course, people are going to say, oh, well, you would say that. But this is the truth. Anytime that the government makes a little tweak, legislation, you're not allowed to own more than one property or something like that. If they were to do that, what you would do is you would go out and you would buy a company, you'd set up a company, and the company would buy the property. And then you'd set up another company, and another company would buy the property. And that would be how you'd get around that, if that was the rule they brought in. And so you'd end up with the exact same thing as before, but now all these companies instead of people. And so you can see these little tweaks that people want to make, they can just be circumvented. But the other thing is negative things can also happen. I think I might have mentioned this a week ago, but New York City in 1945, we'll say, after the war, a lot of vets, a lot of soldiers went off to fight in Europe. They spent 5 years fighting. And when they were coming back as veterans back to America, a lot of them might have left at the age of 18. They were coming back at the age of 23. They want to buy a property. So they arrive into New York City and they find that the prices have all shot through the roof and they can't afford to buy property. It's too expensive now. And so that was a very, very bad look for the government. And so what did they decide to do? They said, you know what? We cannot have these soldiers who went off to fight for their country coming back and not being able to buy a property. This is wrong. So what did they do? They put a price cap on these whole areas. And they said that the property prices in these areas are capped now. You can't rent above a certain amount. You can't sell above a certain amount. And that was the end of it. And so the vets say, this is great. Now we've got these fixed prices. And that's how it worked. Fast forward a couple of decades. And what has happened? Well, you're not able to increase the rent. So if you're not able to increase the rent, it's a little bit like the rent pressure zones here in Ireland. If you can't increase the rent, that means that the market rent everywhere else has gone up, but your properties have stayed down. And so it's no longer attractive for you to do anything with that property because you don't get a return on it. And so what do? You just decide to kind of pretty much leave it. I'm not going to do it up. I'm not going to invest in it. I'm not going to do anything because I can't increase the rent. And so what it did was it ghettoized the entire that entire area in New York City. So you will find that those places become very run down, and all of a sudden, instead of it being an attractive place that was supposed to kind of like be attractive for people, it's no longer attractive to live there because the properties are all run down, they're all falling apart because everyone stopped investing in them years before. So that is one of the reasons why tweaks that are made for a good reason often have a negative side effect down the road that was never even anticipated. The very same thing with the bed sits. Bed sits were seen as this rotten way to live that really you shouldn't expect somebody to share a toilet with multiple other people, and they shouldn't be living, a foot from their kitchen and a foot from their living room, that they should have proper living quarters. Great idea in theory. I support the idea, but by banning bed sits, and making it like 5 year. They basically said it. They made the law in 2008, but they said that this wouldn't really come into effect until 2013. So it's like 5 years. During that 5 year period, everyone knew that this was coming, so they started getting rid of bed sits and everything like that. And at the end of the 2013, suddenly there's no bed sits on the market, and done for the right reasons. But now all of a sudden we have a homeless crisis. And what would have been really handy in a homeless crisis? Hundreds and thousands of bedsits all over the city at the lowest, basically the lowest rung of the ladder. If you want to climb onto the property ladder, the lowest rung was the bedsit. And then above that is house sharing. And then above that, then it's getting into buying your first property or whatever. And you kind of move up the ladder. And eventually you own your own detached home. And maybe you also have the previous property that maybe you had before, and you keep it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but some people have different views. Do you know any firm that deals with building regs or planning in Northern Ireland, the UK? Like, I have friends that are based in the Northern Ireland, the UK. I could ask them who do they, again, connect with me. Anyone on TikTok, connect with me on Instagram and send me a message there. I get messages in on TikTok, but the reality is that it's not a very good platform for messaging. So back and forth and all that kind of stuff, just, you don't even know when somebody's writing a message. Okay, so from C. Ennis, hi Gavin, 100K there and looking for an investment property and looking to get on the ladder. Well, you're in good shape. 100K is a good position to be in. What you should probably do, if you have 100K like ready to invest, what you should do is go out and meet with a broker and get yourself mortgage approved so that you can invest, so that you know what you're entitled, or what you're going to be able to earn, or draw down from a mortgage company. I spoke on my podcast not so long ago with a lady called Mags Barrett, and she has a company called Mortgage Navigators. She is pretty helpful, and she was saying that in order to get a mortgage, you have got to, there's all sorts of background checks and everything that they do, and sometimes it can take up to 6 months to become mortgage approved. And the reason is that they go back over 6 months of bank statements, and you may have little payments in your bank statements that show up as a red flag in a bank's review of your ability to pay a loan. If you have, for example, let's say you, like, when Cheltenham comes around, you go and you put money down on the horses or something like that. So it doesn't sound like a bad thing, but that's a red flag. Oh, this person likes the horses, likes to bet money. Look, they put this money into Paddy Power bookmakers. So when you get that kind of thing, when they start checking all that stuff, all of a sudden you realize that is that's going to hold up your ability to get the loan. Anyway, none of them got. So that's we're talking about the jail for the scapegoat was Bank of Ireland did worse. This is when we were talking about the CEO of Anglo-Irish Bank, David Drum. He went to jail for the things that he did trying to save the bank during the crisis in 2008. And so anyway, landlords, let's have a look what we have here, are some of the least value add parts of the economy. Then cry about, I don't know. There's an awful lot of back and forth here tonight. Not many questions for me to actually answer. So apologies, guys, for those of you listening in. Rent a room threshold never even put up, so no point renting a third room. The best thing the government could do is nothing most of the time. Same with the buy to help scheme. Yeah, another reason that when the government introduces tweaks for the right reason, it can have a negative impact. So the government brought in the first time buyers scheme, the help to buy scheme and all that. Sounds like a great idea. If you've benefited from it, I'm sure you're delighted. But what it's actually done is it's pushed up house prices for anyone in that category of houses. And so you end up, if you have a look at house prices now, first time starter homes have all shot up. And that's because of the support of that system. Let's have a look here. from Max Sweeney. Hi, I'm looking at purchasing an old public house and converting it to a HMO. What do you think? Are you familiar with the planning exemption for pubs? I've been seeing certain things. Yeah, the pub must be vacant for 2 years from what I've heard. So that's the first thing. You have to be able to demonstrate that it's been vacant for 2 years. You do that through the electrical bills. If you can show that the bills dropped off 2 years ago, then you know it's been vacant. Turning it into a HMO, yeah, I've seen a couple of people, some of the clients have done it, and it's probably a good idea. You need to be careful with fire safety. Things like that are very important. You have got to make sure, if you're going to do it, I would put in a proper fire system, not like just, stick the smoke detectors on the roof. You want to get like a proper fire system, because if you're going to get a couple of people into it, then you want to make sure that you're absolutely squeaky clean when it comes to fire regs and things like that. Anyway, let's see. Any more questions? Guys, we're kind of coming to the end of this live. So if you have any more questions, I'll jump in and answer them. But apart from that, we're kind of winding down. I see there's 67 messages here for me to get through. So I'll scroll on down. Let's have a look. What is probate? Okay, I went right back. Let's see. Rent the room, threshold. Oh yeah, 14K. So you can go and get ARP is where you're renting to Ukrainians, things like that. You can do that and you can get 800 a month tax-free, which is actually beneficial, because in order to get 800 into your hands after tax, you need to earn about 1,600. So that's a good scheme. Rent in Northern Ireland has gone up 10%. Have you seen the same rises in the South? Substantially more. We are looking at like our rents are since 2020. So before the pandemic, our rents have gone up 41% since before the pandemic. So it has been a very, very substantial increase, 41% increase in just since the COVID. With the housing crisis across Europe, do you not think your kind are the common denominator? Don't know. It's nothing to do with us. This is the thing that really, it's amazing when you see what happens with people's attitudes. They think that because you buy a house and you rent it out, that you're causing the housing crisis. But the housing crisis is not made up exclusively of people who are trying to buy homes. It's people that are trying to rent homes as well. In fact, the reason that rents are as high as they are is because there's not enough properties on the market to rent. Why is that? Because landlords are pulling out of the market because of this negativity. And so if you had everyone that it was a landlord in the last 5 years, if they stayed in the market, there would be thousands of more properties available to rent in the market, and the property rent would have fallen. It wouldn't have gone up the way it has. But because everyone keeps on blaming landlords keep saying, you know what, I'm out of here. And when they pull out, somebody buys the property, it becomes their home, and now there's fewer properties to go around all the people that are trying to rent. There was a recent survey done, I think it was done by Savills, and they checked the number of properties on the market for rent, and they compared it with the population, and they came up with this figure: 5.9 properties available to rent for every 10,000 people living in the country. Now that'll give you an idea just how slim the choice is. So for every 10,000 people living in Ireland, there are only 5.9 properties available to rent. So does that sound like, out of 10,000 people, does that sound like the landlords are the problem? Doesn't to my ears. Let me see. My Ukrainian flatmate has just been told by the council she will have a new house in 6 months. I don't know about that. I am hearing things, but I'm hearing also the opposite. I'm hearing that they're removing the supports for Ukrainian refugees and stuff like that. So yeah, a lot of the time people are getting information from questionable sources, and like there's a very vocal minority that are anti-immigrant, and they're putting a lot of these negative news stories out there, and I don't know if they're actually true. So something to consider. I'm being asked, where am I from? And so I answered that question. Let's have a look. More questions. I know you're covering property here, but do you know how much much about stock market commodity investing. Yeah, I do know a bit. I've like at the end of the day, I've been in property for over 30 years now, so I know more about that. But of course, the sensible thing to do is to always have a fairly balanced portfolio of assets. And so if you only own property, then you're very susceptible to property swings, negative and positive, which is a good thing, obviously, when the market is rising. But in 2008, like I would say 99% of my assets were property. And then 2008 happened and property fell like 50% or something like that. Like, and I ended up in a lot of trouble in 2008 or post 2008. If I had had more stocks and shares, now, of course, stocks and shares also collapsed in value, but they rebounded quicker than property did. And so I would have had some of my, this thing would have bounced back quicker. So I think it's always a good idea to be quite evenly spread amongst different things. Like I would even suggest if you are interested, like something like Bitcoin, it's probably a good thing to have in your portfolio, not massive sums, because like all these things, it's so volatile that you could be up 20% one day, down 20% the next day. Whereas if you're getting into property, stocks and shares, commodities, some Bitcoin or something like, I wouldn't be going into maybe Ethereum and Bitcoin, but I wouldn't be going into all of these more exotic cryptocurrencies and stuff like that, because you saw what happened with FTX and all things. They all went by the wayside. And so, but I do think spread out and have lots of different things out there in terms of shares. I bought shares in Kingspan years and years ago, and I basically bought the shares and just forgot that I had them, and I left them in this portfolio, and I didn't look at it for, I'd say, 8 or 9 years. And then one day I was sorting out all of my stuff and I opened it up and I was looking through it and I went, oh wow, I forgot that I bought those shares, and it had gone up it had gone up about 10 times what I paid for them in those 8 to 10 years. And like a property wouldn't have gone up by that much. Now the difference is though is that you borrow when you're buying a property, whereas with stocks and shares, a lot of the time you don't borrow. So I wouldn't, if I had bought, the amount that I bought in stocks and shares without a cash, I would have been able to spend maybe 4 or 5 times more if I was buying, a property with the same sum of money. I would have been able to spend 5 times more. Okay, question in from Ross. Would you ever consider buying warehouses to rent out? Absolutely. I would probably consider that before I would consider residential. And the reason is that commercial property is so much easier. Like you don't have all of this negativity that's associated with residential landlords. You don't have people, calling you profiteer and all this good stuff. Like warehouses, now the office market is not great at the moment. I'm involved in multiple office buildings, and that is struggling at the moment. But warehouses are actually still doing really well. The reason warehouses are so popular, and they weren't always popular, but first of all, they're easy to build. Okay, it's like a Meccano set. You just put the metal frame up, and then you clad it, and that's it. You've got a warehouse. Sometimes you'll see some of the newer companies, they're putting up actually timber glue lam, and that'll be the frame. And they put the glue lam frame up, and then they'll clad it, and that's your warehouse. And then big open span warehouse. Who needs that? Factories are required. Like if you've got manufacturing, like printing or anything that has big heavy machinery, they need to be put into a warehouse. And they're not something that's easily moved. So the likelihood is they'll stay there for years. Whereas an office, people can kind of decide to go to somewhere else. Hospitality is another one, like the hotel business. Hotels are a good business, except that you have to constantly be investing in them. If you're not investing in a hotel, then it can sort of lose its shine and its appeal. And then suddenly you find that people are not as keen to stay there. And then you see your revenues coming off. Carl wants to know, would you ever invest in forestry or planting land? Yeah, I don't know much about it, but I do know I have a relative who has forestry investments and stuff. And it's a tax-driven thing. So you're buying a plot of land and you're putting, so much into forestry, and then you get tax breaks on that. Like all of this stuff is like, depending on the motivation, like, do you have income that you're trying to shelter from tax? Then you can go and look at that kind of thing. There's other ways, like getting back to the warehouse thing. One of the reasons that it's really good, if you think about it from this point of view, you can go to an office, you can sit down at a desk and you can work there. But the reality is you can also be sitting at home. I'm sitting at home now. My computer's in front of me. I could be doing this in the office or I can be doing it at home. So you can be either or. So you don't need the office. Whereas if you're, we'll say a factory building, or if you're, let's say you do up cars or something like that. Let's say you replace engines and cars and wheels and cars and stuff. You need a warehouse for that thing because you're going to have heavy lifting equipment to lift the cars, all that kind of stuff. You can't do that at home. You can only do that in a warehouse. So a warehouse is going to always be needed, whereas offices now are in question. And also, if you think about the process of anything, right? We'll say this calculator here, okay? This calculator gets manufactured in a warehouse or in a factory building somewhere. They bend the plastic, they do all this kind of stuff. That thing gets put into a box. Where did the box get made? The box got made in another factory somewhere. That box and this calculator, they get put together and you box it up and you put the lid on and you wrap it up, and that's your product that you're going to go and sell on the market. Where does that get stored while you're waiting for it to be sold in the market? It gets sold or gets stored in a big storage distribution warehouse. So you can see it's needed through almost every step of the chain. And so you need the warehouse for the company that makes the calculators, but then they'll sell it to Amazon. Amazon, where do they put it? They put it into a big distribution warehouse as well. So that is a good way to look at warehouses. So that's one of the reasons why I think I would invest in warehouses. So I hope that answers the question. And also, we talked about the stocks, and so just make sure that you have a fairly good distribution across multiple things. And that way, if one of them falls, hopefully the other one stays up, and you end up with a bit of balance in your portfolio. Okay, let me see. What about doing Airbnb for a room or two? Is there any good? Like Airbnb, there's restrictions on Airbnb that you have to be aware of. And like you can't do Airbnb in a rent pressure zone, to the best of my knowledge, and you need planning and things like that. So there's a lot of different things that you need to be careful of. So let me see. I'm sorry, I got a private message. It looks like your profile. No, sorry. Laura says that she got a private message from me. It's not me. Okay, so there is a imposter on TikTok trying to let on to be me. Usually, I only go by Gavin J. Gallagher on my handle. There is no variation of that I use. So if it's Gavin J. Gallagher 02, I've complained multiple times. Still, TikTok won't take this person down. I think if enough people complained about him, maybe it will. There was another person, I think it's the same guy, but it was Gavin J. Gallagher, but instead of J, they had an I, so it kind of looked a little bit like my name, but it had a Gavin I. Gallagher. And he had my profile photo and all that. Was basically screenshotting my videos and putting them up as his, getting thousands of followers and views and stuff, and then writing to people, sending messages saying, hey, I've got an investment here that I'm promoting, crypto this, crypto that, and like it's just a scammer trying to get you. So be very careful about that. So Laura, thanks for writing in there. Ross was asking, is this going on YouTube? Yes, everything, all these live streams every week are in my live stream section on my YouTube. So just go into the YouTube. I think I've done like maybe 8 or 9 of these now, so you've got plenty to go back over. Question from Gallagher O'Neill. Hi, Gavin. We have recently converted outbuilding, turned it into a 2-story studio beside our own home, and living room, bedroom, kitchen. Apart from Airbnb, is there another platform you would use? I think he's going to say you would use. Yeah, you would recommend. Yeah, so Airbnb is one. Booking.com. If you're doing short-term kind of lets like Airbnb, then booking.com is quite heavily used for that as well. What people will call it is serviced accommodation. SA is another one. And if Airbnb is one platform people use, but also booking.com. It's the place that you can go to book your hotels when you're away and stuff like that. Do you think converting empty commercial properties to residential in town centers will provide a high yield? Would I advise it? I would advise that you look at it and you study it. But yeah, like in theory, I think this is all a good idea. If you think about it, like any time I've made a big profit in property, it hasn't been, most of the time it's not been in residential. It's actually been in commercial. And that is because commercial property can be valued quite differently. Residential property is worth what it's worth, and it's based on what all the properties in that area around it are worth. Whereas with commercial property, it's based on the income that's being generated. So if a property is sitting empty, usually the value of that property goes right down, and it goes down to almost its like build cost. And in fact, it might be valued at less than its build cost. So it would cost you less to buy that property than it would cost you to buy the land and build it. And so that's obviously you're getting it for a good deal. Now, if you can do that and you can get a tenant into it and the tenant can rent it out, suddenly the value goes shooting up again. So that's one way of doing it. But the other thing is you're buying something that is unwanted and unpopular. So naturally enough, the prices are low. And then you go and turn it into a use that has a huge amount of popularity and a huge amount of demand. So it's called arbitrage when you do that. You take one asset that is being underpriced because of its use, and you turn it to a different use, and suddenly it changes and it becomes much, much more valuable. And that's actually, believe it or not, like if you go back, Sam Bankman-Fried, the guy who's gone to jail for 25 years for the FTX crypto exchange collapse, he made his millions doing arbitrage in Japan. And what he was doing is he noticed that people were buying Bitcoin and they were buying it on the US exchange, like in these US things, and they were buying it at a price. And he noticed that the Japanese market was not changing prices as quickly as America was. So he could buy in a Bitcoin in America and sell it in Japan in the same transaction. Like literally he'd hold it for half a second and he'd sell it, but he could make 50,000 just in a couple of seconds because of the pricing differential. And so he started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he started, trying to move like tens of millions of Bitcoin in one transaction and sell it in China or something like that, or in Japan, and started making like literally millions doing this. And so that's arbitrage. Take an asset that's underpriced in one market and sell it where it's priced at a different higher price in another market, and you can make a huge fortune doing that. So guys, we're coming to the end. I've got 4 messages left. Where is the proof? First, global warming disproved. Climate change arguable. Now cloud seeding. I don't know. Some people. Any advice on Airbnb? Is it profitable and popular in rural Ireland? Yes, I know people that are doing rent to rent, which we talked about earlier. And if you missed that talk on rent to rent, just go back and look at the video. Go into my YouTube channel, Gavin J. Gallagher, and you'll be able to watch this video back. But I talked about what rent to rent is. How's the marathon training coming along? I'm not training for marathon at the moment. I do enjoy marathon training, but I've hurt my Achilles, so not doing it at the moment. People don't see the work it takes behind the scenes to buy property and the sacrifice it takes. Absolutely. What's the percentage tax percentage for landlords? I think it depends on what your income is, but usually people are already, they have a job or something like that, so they're already at the higher rate. So if you buy a property, any profit that you have above your borrowings is 52% tax. If you don't pay your rent over a month or longer, what can happen? Your rent to your landlord, well, if you think about it from the point of view of a landlord is renting a property to you, and the most likely scenario is they have a mortgage, and their mortgage is payable every month. And if you stop paying rent to him, he has to either prop up the mortgage out of his other sources of income, which maybe he doesn't have that. So it puts him under huge pressure. What can happen is the bank, if he misses that payment for long enough, the bank will step in and will force him to sell the property. So one way or another, you're going to lose your property that you're renting. But the other thing is that you'll probably get evicted. Now, the longer it takes for you to repay the rent that you missed, the more difficult it becomes. Because if you can't pay 2,000 this month, and then next month you owe another 2,000. Well, now if you missed last month, then you owe 4,000 this month. If you're struggling to get 2, why do you think that 4 is going to be easier to get your hands on? It's not. You're going to be in difficulty, So that's one of the reasons. Downey's Pub. Are you best buying property through a trust if you have one through your pension? Like, a trust is a good way to do it, but you got to look at, like, if I were you, just get some tax advice. It's worth the cost of the advice just to understand, like, what are you trying to achieve? And ultimately you'll end up knowing whether or not it was a good idea. The government takes half the rent in tax. That's correct. Is there a way around increasing rental prices more than the allowed amount? Yes, talked about that a little bit earlier. You can keep the property empty for a while. You can go and increase its energy performance, or you can do a refurbishment of it. Can you rent a converted garage tax-free? You can. The only way you can do it tax-free, to the best of my knowledge, is to go with the ARP, which is, I think, where you go and put a Ukrainian in, and that's 800 a month tax-free. What advice on what to do with 800K? Well, first of all, I wouldn't be writing that you have 800K in the comments here, because you're going to have people looking at going, oh, this lad has 800K. Sit on it. Don't feel pressure to invest it with anyone or anything. If I were you, I would have a think about, first of all, do you have any tax to pay on that? If you don't, you're in a fortunate position. Then what you got to do is think, where do I want to be 10 years from now? And, like, financially, where do you want to be 10 years from now? But also, what would you like to do with your time? What would you like to be doing in 10 years' time? And if that is an image that you have of a certain lifestyle or a certain kind of way or whatever, then that 800 grand, some amount of that might be invested into training and coaching and whatever. Some of it might go into, buying land that could eventually be turned into something, or it could just be that you simply, invested into a couple of different assets and create like an income stream from it. So, do you accept HAP? I don't have properties that are HAP, but I know plenty of people who do, and they don't have a problem with it. The only thing is if you're trying to get paid for HAP for the first time, I think it can be a bit of a delay. So I know somebody who was waiting 5 months to get it or something, or maybe that was some other scheme. Old commercial building around the mid-70s. Do the normal fire safety rules and regulations apply? Yes, they do, unfortunately. Yeah, so Laura's saying that imposter. Yeah, do, Laura, send me a screenshot if you want. And hi, Gavin, huge fan. All the best, Costin. Oh, thank you. That's great. Anyway, guys, look, that's it. Hope you found this one useful. I'm coming up on 2 hours. Every week we do this. Remember, the entire video has been captured in YouTube. So go into my YouTube. I also have it in my Instagram there. So you can also find it in Instagram. I post it to YouTube and Instagram. So hope you found this one useful. Looking forward to seeing you next week.